Hi there, everyone. We're just waiting for the last couple of people to walk through the virtual door. So first of all, thank you so much for joining us this morning for the second session for the Turn It Up conference. We're super excited to have a jam-packed program for you. And really, I'm also very excited about being able to spend the next hour and a half with you all, especially my panel members. So my name's Ben Neal. I work for Kapia. I'm an associate, and my specialist areas are around social inclusion and housing. When we came up with the conference, I was really excited to look at what are some of the ways that we can potentially make engagement more accessible, and to think about that from a cohort perspective, even though we know that there are many rules or initiatives that we can take that will make engagement more accessible for many members of our community. So just before we start officially, and I know we've still got a few people come through, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands that you're joining us from today, and Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people who may be participating. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and recognise and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of Australia. I'd like to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and I'm joining you today from Wurundjeri land. I think, it's very common for us to do an acknowledgement whenever we start a session, whether it's online or in person. And for me, it's a really important thing that we do, but it's also important that that's not just our only acknowledgement of Aboriginal people in the session. And so I guess one kind of invitation that I give to you at the beginning is to just hold in your mind around how some of these conversations may be applicable to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So just in terms of an outline of today's session, we're going to have a panel discussions with my fabulous guests. That will take around 45-50 minutes. There'll be some opportunities for questions in there as well. And then we're going to pop you off into some breakout rooms. We're going to try and recreate the sense that certainly my fellow Melburnians have been missing out on for a while, where we create an environment where people are able to wander around from table to table and participate in some various discussions. Don't worry, we'll give you some instructions from a technology perspective around that. And we've also got a number of people who can help us support that process. That discussion, we're really going to try and work on some golden rules for accessible engagement in a COVID normal world. I know that there's people joining us from different states and potentially people from different countries as well, who are at different stages in the COVID journey. But we do know that things are not going to be the same for any of us, probably for quite a significant amount of time. And so we need to look at how we do engagement and make sure that it is accessible for various cohorts, and with some of those considerations about what COVID normal may mean and what that may mean for our engagement. There is opportunities for people to share resources today. We'll be sharing some resources as we talk. If you want to share resources in the chat function, we'd love to see that. We'd love to share that. I know that both our panel members, myself and everyone in the audience is super keen to learn. So I guess one of my other thoughts was that, we probably could have had a conference that just focused on accessible engagement and really, I guess, kind of highlighted challenges for various sections of our community. Accessibility is such a wide range and such a significant issue in terms of how we talk to people and how we engage with our communities. Some people have limited issues, limited digital literacy issues. Some people have limited mobility. Some people suffer from geographic isolation. Some people have sensory impairments. And then there's the kind of language and literacy issues that may people come across. And I guess I want to kind of hold my hand up and tell you that we're not going to give you the answers to all forms of accessible engagement today. Our aim is to really have a conversation with two people and talk about what accessibility has meant for them as people and for the cohorts that they work with. I think that that will give us some really deep insights into some of the challenges that these groups face. And then, you know, my hope is that as a team, as a group, we'll be able to work on some of those golden rules for accessible engagement. Some of the tools that are available from CAPEA are in particular around accessible engagement for young people. This is a publication which, you know, excuse my language, but it's called Young People Don't Give a Shit, Why Should We? And that's got some tips in there and some principles around making engagement accessible for young people. There's some other tools that I'll share, like I said, as the session progresses. But I'd like to introduce our panel members. So first of all, we've got Olivia Beasley. So Olivia is a Community Engagement Coordinator from Expression Australia. She was born and raised in the Australian deaf community, and she brings a very rich understanding on culture and language of the community. She's also passionate about connecting with youth and women. And just prior to the session, we were talking about an amazing experience she had with the Victorian Youth Governor or Youth Parliament in 2019. I think, you know, again, we talked about this with Olivia prior. When we talk about accessibility in particular cohorts, no cohort wears one hat. So Olivia is from the deaf community. She's also a young woman. And so there's a number of kind of factors in there. And then we also have Abdi Aziz Farrar, and he's from the Himelo Connect program up in Heidelberg in Melbourne. Abdi is an incredible young man who's done so much for the Somalian community. He's also executive board member at the Islamic Council of Victoria. So both of you, welcome and thank you so much for giving your time today. As I said before, I'm really looking forward to the conversations that we're going to have. So first of all, Olivia, I think you know, our audience may not be that aware of the work that Expression does. I'm just wondering if you could tell me a little bit about the organisation and your role there.
Yes, of course. So Expression Australia was previously known as VicDeaf. It's the Victorian Deaf Society, and we've been around for 136 years. The organisation really is quite broad in its services, but it does focus on the deaf and hard of hearing community in Victoria and Tasmania. So there's a lot of programs and support that the organisation provides for people who don't have any literacy, up to people who work in professional sectors. There are a lot of people within our community that require support of different things in different areas of their life, but we focus on interpreting and making sure that deaf and hard of hearing people have access to interpreting in their lives. Also Auslan resources, information in their language. And also to ensure that people have the support in other areas of their lives that they may need to access the mainstream community in an equitable way to the rest of the community. My role really focuses on, within the organisation, focuses on engaging with the community and ensuring that they have access to mainstream services. And, you know, mainstream services could be lots of different things. It's different organisations and government and different levels, and ensuring that we have access to those things. We are a minority community, and so we provide feedback to different organisations about what we need as far as our language and our culture to make sure that we can engage with them. We have a lot of videos that are created in Auslan as well to make sure the information that is out there for the mainstream community is accessible for deaf and hard of hearing people in their first language. There's been a lot of information and videos produced through COVID, obviously, and that is something that we have a big focus on. It's not a large organisation, as in it's a large organisation for the deaf community, but the community is quite small.
Thanks, Olivia. And look, I'll put in a shameless plug for Expression. They provided the interpreters today who are already doing a fantastic job. So thank you. And Abdi, would you like to kind of talk a little bit about Himelo, some of the programs that you run and your role in the organisation?
Thanks, Ben, and hello, everyone. I'll also like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land we are meeting today and pay my respect to the elders, past and present, and those who might be here with us. Himelo Community Connect was born out of a core design process in 2006. It was the first of its kind, and I will be using it as an example later on in terms of how to effectively do engagement with communities. But the word Himelo itself is a Somali word. It means purposeful aspirations. And the name came about through the core design process, because when we're working with the older Somali Australian community who migrated here, there was a sense of hopelessness and sense of just give up, because they've been here hoping that the kids will have a better life. They've worked as with other previous migrants, but intergenerational poverty and things were not changing. So with the elders, it was lack of hope, and with the young people, it was just sense of no purpose. So purposeful aspirations is what Himelo means. So we've got a 12 activity-based programs from early childhood to elders, youth leadership, case management, and we are the only program of its name, or we started as being the first of its kind to respond to the needs of the Somali Australian community in particular. And our model has now been duplicated to work with other African communities and extended into other areas where there's significant Somali community. My role here, I'm the general manager, and there's a strong team of 8 that work with me.
Thank you, Abdi. And I guess, like I talked about at the beginning, this notion of accessibility, one of the challenges that I've kind of witnessed is that quite often we can lump very large groups together. So that might be the call community. And I think, typically my observation in Melbourne over the last kind of 5 to 10 years has been the African community. And I'm just so pleased that, we've had a relationship for a while now, but this notion of being able to gain insights into how Somalis are engaging with their own community is absolutely fantastic. So, like I said, we're really, really happy to have you here. So, I think for me, one of the purposes of this session is that we highlight some of the things that are not good practice. And, I want people to walk away with various learnings, but if one key one is, I'm never, ever going to do that, that's a positive for me. So I guess, Olivia, do you want to talk to me maybe about some of the biggest kind of engagement accessibility fails that you've witnessed, whether that's personally, whether that's through your work, and I'm also really keen to understand what the impact of that might have been.
Yeah, I think there's numerous that I've experienced, but one that I'd like to talk about is the idea of tokenism. And really that is quite prevalent and has a big impact on people in different communities, in different ways, I'd say. For the deaf community and for young people and for women, or gendered communities, I guess, organizations and businesses or even government will often sort of want to tick that box to say, yep, that's satisfies what we need to do, and it makes them look good, makes their position look good, and as far as having engaged with young people or whoever, but that's not a realistic representation of what's happening. So with deaf and hard of hearing community, sometimes we might engage, we'll have a community specific project or something that is happening, and then they might bring in like one deaf or hard of hearing person might be brought into the consultation process, and that's not a true representation of the depth and breadth of the community, but they're able to tick the box to say yes, that is accessible and that's been engaged, but it's not true. With young people, the tokenism is quite often where an organization will say, you know, we're trying to be hip and on trend by engaging with young people, but they don't actually do that. So you're not giving young people opportunities to develop skills and to grow within themselves. You're just bringing them in and then letting them go once you've gotten what you want from them. And that can have really big impacts on people. It's a waste of our time because we're trying to navigate the world and have opportunities, but it seems like that's what's going to happen, but it isn't what happens. And so I think whatever the project that someone is being brought in for, it's not really benefiting them or the project. And with women as well, I think, this has been a very long spanning issue where women are sort of used for our thoughts and our they were sort of brought in, but then we're not really engaged properly. And it feels very much like we're ticking a box. And I think that happens so often. I think that's happened personally for me, and also it can happen in other contexts, including work.
And I guess, I'm really interested, Olivia, for your reflections in terms of that type of tokenism happening to you. What was the personal impact?
Yeah. When I would be invited to participate in some sort of activity, I'm giving up my time to be a part of this. I'm quite motivated. I want to see change. I want to see awareness in the community, within the deaf community, and also as a young person and as a female. And, then I'll turn up and I realize, oh, this is kind of wasting my time. And it affects me because it affects my motivation levels and my energy to be involved in this sort of activity. I'm thinking it's 2020. Come on. We should be better than this by now. Like, why are you wanting me involved? Is it just because having me there looks good? The optics, I think also it can affect your mental health, because you're kind of always having to advocate for yourself and your time, and making sure I have to make sure that I've got accessible language there, and with interpreters, and also culturally as well. And I think a lot of that can sometimes fall on me. So yeah, it's tiring.
Thank you. I think one of the things you've touched on for me is kind of demonstrates how everything is linked, and that something in the engagement field we talk about is fatigue, and quite often engagement fatigue is a result of bad engagement, because people feel that they've had conversations where it was tokenistic or they weren't particularly listened to, and that means it's much, much harder the next time somebody else wants to talk with them. Thank you, Olivia. And what about you, Abdi? From an accessibility kind of failure perspective with engagement, what's some of the kind of poor things that you've witnessed?
Thanks, Ben. I'll second that, Olivia. The exhaustion at the end of the day, where you feel that you're really pushing for something that should naturally be there, and should be available and accessible to everyone. And then you spending all your energy trying to get an outcome for an individual or a community, and going home at the end of the day and thinking, do I really need to do that? So I echo your frustration and experience there, Olivia. I think for me, the biggest engagement accessibility failure will have to be the hard lockdown. And I choose that because I think it's fresh on people's minds, and at least it is being on the media. And that's when the state government has announced that they're locking down the public housing high rises. People call them towers. I call them high rises or public housing. And there was no prior notice. It was just, we're locking it down and we're locking it now. And we had incidents where people were visiting people were out in there. So people who were in there were not allowed to leave. People who were out could come in, but they could not leave after. So what that meant for me, it's just, you have got a cohort where by their own admission, the state government classified them as the most vulnerable members of the community. And having that approach of military or police state approach rather than a public health. And the discussions were, or the approach from the department was one that was focused on infection control. So it was more of a health response rather than a social response, which was a big failure because you're dealing with people who've got multiple issues. So you've got mainstream Australian community members who might have mental health, drug dependence, other issues. But you have those buildings also have a significant refugee population, people who fled people in uniforms, so police states, because of brutality, and have got a lived experience of torture and trauma, displacement, limited language, and not understanding the whole concept. So just looking outside their window and having to see 500 police officers in uniform with guns all of a sudden surrounding them has actually reignited a lot of trauma. That also led into the exclusion of the community leaders, community members, and the residents of those buildings from being part of the process to actually participate in rectifying whatever has been happening, but also working with DHHS and other government departments in addressing the community. So it was 4 days before we can actually had people on the table and community members having conversations. So if I just then get into the impact that had, it was quite traumatizing for people. I was receiving phone calls from single mothers who live there, who did not have the milk for their infants. Some of those milk were, there was a lot of allergies that they needed to, it had to be a specific brand. They were running out of nappies, medications, basic things. A 1-800 number was established in the next day of the hard lockdown, but you had to speak English to access that number. And if you didn't speak English, you had to call 1-300 number and request to, someone in your language and interpret in your language in English first. So then that person would then call the 1-800 number. So it was a mixture of, it was just a quite complex. In terms of food and basic essentials, people's religious and cultural preferences or requirements were not met. So people were not having halal food. Rochelle, I think if you could mute yourself, that would be good. So people were having, the cultural and religious dietary requirements not met. But I think the biggest failure was creating anxieties for residents in there and not providing an explanation in their first language and not meeting their immediate health and essential needs.
Mm. Look, thanks, Abdi. I would say, that situation probably for many years will be a kind of case study around, probably what not to do from a community engagement perspective. And let's hope that there are significant learnings that come out of that. I have some concept of what that must have been like for those families having grown up in high-rise public housing, but I can't imagine the trauma and the kind of the impact of the lack of knowledge of what was happening at that time. So thank you for sharing. So they're kind of some of the sort of poorer experiences that you've had. Are there any other kind of common mistakes that you see as making engagement inaccessible for your community, Abdi?
I think making assumptions about the community that we work, I think that's the biggest engagement mistakes that I see, or making engagement inaccessible. We go to university, other institutions to learn about our work, and then we go in there. And when I say making assumptions, it means just thinking that you know what people are going through. And it's exactly the same thing that was happening in the hard lockdown. The public housing residents will give them 2 weeks rent-free. We'll provide them food, and that should be okay. What is there to complain about? But making assumptions as that they will be okay, we don't know. You can't see a client coming into your office and expect that you know everything about them, and you will have that individual. Same should apply to the community. So assumption is a really big thing. The other thing that makes accessibility difficult is the world in which we operate, our values, our rules. I do a lot of consultancy and mentoring for new social workers. And when they start working with migrant and refugee communities, the person, I'm usually the first person they call and say, look, I've started working with this cohort, what can you tell me? What are some of the challenges? What do I need to be aware of? When that role is reversed and it's a migrant or refugee person, we expect them to know everything. And when they don't comply with our norms and values and processes, we don't look at them lightly. And I go to court where the judge or magistrate often says, oh, you had a difficult childhood here, you dealt with separation and your father leaving your home. To the Anglo child, the white child, but when it comes to a migrant African Black kid who was a child soldier, lost both parents in the war, had to come through displacement and refugee experience, it's like you should know better. And the response and sympathy is not there because it's not the typical, he doesn't have the typical narratives that we do. So how do we apply our own rules and values in our work is a big engagement barrier. So it's important, like being inclusive. And I think Olivia before talked about the tokenistic person. Just having one migrant or a refugee person, and in my case, that's where I work mostly, on the table. And often that person is the only person in that room who is not being paid to be there or compensated for their time. Inclusion doesn't mean just having a tokenistic person there, whether it's a person with disability or gender or color, whether you're Black. It's much more than that. So lack of inclusiveness, and that's what we have seen finally in the response to the hard lockdown. There were all these funded organizations to work with residents in there, but none of them had workers who were from those communities that spoke their language. So reflection in organizations, it's are we really inclusive and reflect diversity in our workforce? Thank you.
Thanks, Abdi. And I couldn't agree more with you in terms of, and I use this kind of respectfully, using that community that you're working with from an engagement perspective. We had an amazing experience in Ascot Vale where we employed a public housing tenant who effectively worked with us to engage those tenants there, and the power of that as an act for her as an individual, but also just the deep richness that it added to the engagement process was really fantastic. Olivia, what about from you? Some common mistakes for any of the cohorts that you work with?
Yeah, I was actually going to say something quite similar to Abdi. I think a common mistake is with engagement is assumptions. And it's a really dangerous thing to do, to make assumptions about someone, you know, and you never know what, you know, what might actually be happening in the community if you make assumptions. I think also talking about just having someone who comes involved into the towers with no experience, no understanding of the people who live there and their experiences, that is such a common thing to happen within cold communities, with the deaf community as well, and with young people. I think if someone who is not familiar with that group, say an older male, was to come in to a group with young women, and trying to engage, there's a huge disconnect there, and can cause some really great issues. You need to really think about how to be inclusive and who would engage best with that group. And with Expression Australia, we have a huge commitment to having a deaf person engage with the deaf community. And we have evidence, we've seen how much of a disconnect there can be if we have an organisation, if a non-deaf staff member or a hearing person comes in and tries to work with some groups, and you can see that it doesn't. We've learned from past experiences the importance of having people with same experiences in, say, a consultation and leading a consultation. They know the environment, they know the culture, and they know the background of the people. And the outcomes and the difference between the outcomes of those two types of engagement is huge. And I think I'm not sure about the refugee situation and the culture and understanding, but for deaf people and young people and women as well, you know, the assumptions about types of engagement activities, you know, we lose trust with people very quickly if we can see that they're not coming about things the right way. And it's very difficult to build those relationships back up once they've been damaged. It's important to go into something in the right way rather than trying to fix it later because of assumptions that have been made. And a lot of time and energy can be lost from that. So I think it's such a common thing that has happened. I think assuming that also, you know, what language we use within the deaf community, so assuming that, you know, knowing that Auslan is our language. It has a name. It's the Australian Sign Language. Understanding, people often think that we all sign the same language around the world, and that we can just use American Sign Language, but it's not based on our language, on English, because we both speak the same, have the same spoken languages in our countries. It's like us having to learn Spanish. It's understanding on a language level that we use a different language. That's just one common thing that also comes up. And also assuming that the community is all the same. You know, there's so much diversity in any group. You need to look and see the community and see the diversity and not take it as one big group of the same people. You know, you're looking at myself now, I'm signing, and I'm from a deaf family though. I was born into a deaf family, and Auslan is my first language and the language that I used growing up. But only 5% of the deaf community or deaf people were born of people who were deaf. 95% of people are born into families where they may have never met a deaf person before. So they're not understanding or aware of the culture and the language, and that's not passed on. So there's a lot of deaf people and a lot of people in the community who've not come from that experience, may join later in life, or may never join the deaf community. And so that tokenism is really dangerous if you have someone who is not just having one person, you're not able to show the breadth of the experiences of the deaf community. And you miss out on a lot because of that.
That's so interesting. Thank you, Olivia. And I guess, I think you've touched on this a couple of examples, but I guess I'm keen to know, are there any particular engagement kind of events or activities that you've actually participated in that you felt that there was a significant effort to make them more accessible for any one of the cohorts that you feel that you represent?
Yes. This is something that I will never get sick of talking about, and I have huge respect for the YMCA Victoria. They're an organisation that, is known for sports and camps and that sort of thing, but they actually have such a huge range of activities and engagement that they partake in. So with YMCA Victoria, like was said when I was introduced, I was a part of the YMCA Youth Parliament program. So I've been involved for 3 or 4 years now with that program. When I first engaged with the program, I was a participant. I was not part of the task force that organises the event, but they were very open. They would ask questions. They hadn't had deaf people involved before, but they wanted to find out how to involve deaf youth in their program and make sure that we felt engaged and comfortable in the space and in their program. They made no assumptions. They asked us questions, and they were very welcoming, and they were keen to work with us wherever possible. And they understood that we always have to be the ones working really hard to fit into the mainstream community. It's not something that comes naturally. We're always engaging with people who don't know our culture and our language. And it's hard to always be doing that and having to be the ones putting the work. But the YMCA put in the effort to make sure that we were engaged. And it's the same with young people engaging with older people in their community. With this, it was led by young people. So it was another area where we're sort of on the same playing field as far as experiences. And so we had people who were able to help us get engaged. It's a 1-year program. It's an annual program that runs for about 4 or 5 months. And there was a huge amount of support in our access if we had any feedback about things that could be improved to help our experience, and they took that on board. They didn't sort of say, oh, that's going to be cost prohibitive, or that's going to be too hard to do. This is how our program works and always has. They worked with us. The Parliament program, Parliament Part, actually happens in Parliament House in Melbourne. There's a huge, rich history, obviously, in that place, but Parliament House works with the YMCA Victoria Youth Parliament program to make sure that it's accessible for us, and so we were able to be there and participate in all of the activities and things. They changed the way some of the etiquette that they have to make sure that we were able to be involved in the program. And that is a huge thing for us, and that effort was really evident.
Yeah, thank you. And I think, we've probably all been in situations, whether it's engagement or not, where the response to a request has been, that's the way we always do things. And it sounds like, YMCA have got, a real openness in terms of the way they work, and that's really fantastic to hear. And Abdi, from your perspective, is there any engagement that you've been involved with that you feel that have been particularly accessible for, I guess, for you, like I said, to you personally, or for a particular element of the communities that you work with?
Yep. I'll say Himela because I work there, and it's a good program. But in all seriousness, I think the core design process that led to the establishment of Himelo, I think that's a good, an excellent example of how well things work when communities are not tokenistically engaged, but have got an equal say, and sit there on the table as equal partners of whatever programs that are being done. So during the initial co-design, there was a funding from the state government, and it was mainly a response to concerns about radicalization and violent extremism. There were some incidents that the Somali community, young Somali community members were part of, and there was concern within the government that this is becoming an overrepresentation issue and it needed to be addressed. But two things happened when it was time to set up the program. The first one is the community said, here we go, another consultation. We are every couple of years, someone comes with a big book, tells us what your problems are, and we tell our stories, and they say, thank you very much. And they actually have got a term for them. They call them, we hear you crowd. So you just come and they say, we hear you, oh, that must be terrible, and then they disappear. So they say, look, we're not interested, we're being consulted to death. So we say, no, this is not a consultation, it's actually a core design and you have an equal say. And they did not believe that. So that was number one. Number two, they said, you can take your money somewhere else. Thank you very much. We are not here to talk about violent extremism or radicalization. We are already stigmatized and we don't want to be further stigmatized with this label. So if your program is about radicalization and violent extremism, thank you very much for your interest, but take it somewhere else. And I think that was very strong from the community because they saw that they were going to be further victimized by being labeled of people who have got radicalized. They say we're dealing with racism, discrimination, unemployment, all of those things. Now, we can't add radicalization to that list. We're not going to accept this. And that was that assertion from the community actually took the program to be reimagined and redeveloped. So what the community said was, if you want to co-design a program, you can't have preconceived outcomes. We will sit there on the table, we will work through issues, and based on that, we will form a program based on the community needs. And to their credit, the department and the staff were willing. So a program that was what was supposed to take in 2 months took 8 months. And that is, it shows that it's organic. And if you want to work with communities, you can't have KPIs. You can't say, all right, boy, this month we have to have these consultations by this. You have to work with the community. So 8 weeks, 8 months process. And the community were listened to. They identified, obviously there were a range of issues that needed to be addressed, but they picked up the 4 or 5 that they needed to work. And there were 123 members of the community that participated. What worked well in that was just the respect and the engagements that we had in there. So I think that co-design process was one of the best examples that I've seen in terms of community engagement.
That's fantastic, Abdi. Thanks. And I think, like I said, I'm hoping that people leave with a number of learnings from this session. But if one of them is that they don't want to be part of that "we hear you" crowd, then that's a fantastic lens for us all to look at our work through. And I think, the kind of one of the standouts there for me as well is is being flexible from a time perspective.
Yeah.
If engagement is to be genuine, and I know this is difficult sometimes from a client perspective, but being able to adjust your time frames so that you're really genuine about working with the community. And I think, your project especially it crosses that line between engagement and community development. And I think, it's been really clear that some of your kind of positive strategies that you've taken around accessibility have really kind of come from a community development base and really assisted in developing that community. So on to our last question now for both of you. I guess, are there any kind of like maybe 2 or 3 key considerations that you think engagement professionals need to consider from an accessibility perspective in a COVID normal world? I'll go to you, Abdi, first, and then Olivia. I know we talked before about the challenge for the deaf community and the use of masks, and I'm really keen to hear from you about that. But first, Abdi.
What I would say is you should engage with the community, not the community leaders. And this is specifically for people who are working with migrant and refugee communities, but also those who are working with cohorts like public housing tenants in the high-rise buildings. There's a diversity of communities, and there's often community leaders. And to their credit, the community leaders are doing well, but often they're not the ones who are feeling the most impact of the social issues. And they're often articulate, they're often assertive, and can advocate for their needs. And usually what happens is we engage with the usual suspects, people we know who articulate, and we take advice from there. With the Himilo design, we had subgroups, we had women. So I didn't want to speak with men about issues that women have and children. So we had engagement sessions with the young people. We had mothers who did not speak English. We had to organize childcare because we can't ask mothers to come with 3 kids. The average Somali family is 7. So we have to make it accessible. So accessibility is just not, it's more than being inclusive and providing an environment, but it's also enabling people to be on the table, using an interpreter where it's required. So engaging with the people. Secondly, I think not coming with any assumptions, whether they are positive or negative. Sometimes we either say, oh, they're living there, so they must have difficulties and they must be unable to do that. So we underestimate the people's ability. And if you're talking about refugees, who's more resilient than someone who experienced lost family members, came to a new country where everybody looks different, picked up the language and trying to make a living. It doesn't get more resilient, and people just come and underestimate, they're refugees, they're poor, we need to represent them. They're more resilient, they just need a platform. So engaging with people by not overstating their ability or understating their ability, but sitting with the table. And often I say, be the naive inquirer. Just say, tell me what is happening without making any assumptions. Those are the 2 key issues for me. And third and finally, not generalizing. Not all refugees are the same. So if you're a Somali refugee, you are dealing with difficulties, but if you're a Somali women refugee, there's a different layer. And if you are young Muslim Somali refugee women, it's a 3rd layer. So not just assuming that all Africans are the same, or all women are the same, or all people with hearing impairments are the same. Having to work with communities and the cohorts that you're working, and making no assumptions. Yep.
Thanks, Abdi. That's you know, I think if we only took those three things, we would be making a significant difference in terms of working with that cohort. Olivia, same question to you, just in terms of that making engagement more accessible, kind of in this new sort of COVID normal world, and we did discuss previously the impact of masks on the deaf community. So I'm interested in your insight for both of those issues.
Yeah, sure. So I guess first off, I'll talk about my three things. Really be as creative as possible, I'd say. Think outside of the box. You know, think of a really unique way of engaging with people outside of the box. The second, I would say, empathy is super important. You know, it seems like a basic thing, but trying to understand, you know, you'll never understand someone else's experience, and that's fine, but trying to put yourself in their shoes goes a long way, and showing that goes a long way. Asking questions rather than assuming makes people feel comfortable and open. And thirdly, this one is really my number one recommendation for people. Making your engagement as inclusive as possible, genuinely, through, you know, the different activities like we've talked about. Tokenism is a big no-no, but having someone who has lived experience within that group as part of the process of the engagement, not just those engagement sessions, but throughout the whole process. And that's really important because it gives other people the understanding that you're embedding that engagement throughout the whole process, and not just sort of bring people on at certain times. And that will really strengthen the process and encourage people to be involved. You know, if you want a specific community, their advice and insight, then you need to engage them authentically throughout the process. And then in regards to your comment, Ben, or question about the masks, yeah, it has been has had a huge impact on the deaf and hard of hearing community. Accessibility has been lost in many ways. Our language relies on our hands, but also our facial expressions is a huge part of the language. So once you remove half of the face, and that impacts the way that the language is able to be understood and expressed. And we've been working with DHHS quite closely because of their health guidelines, making sure that we have that deaf and hard of hearing people feel comfortable in the wider community and out in the streets. The masks, we have now been allowed to take them off in the official guidelines for communicating. And it's not, you know, it's for us. It's like we've worked on that communication with DHHS to ensure that we're able to communicate with people. I think, you know, when advocating, the attitude is really important. It's not just deaf people, but everyone who, a lot of other groups within the community are struggling because of the masks, having to wear them all of the time, having to think about purchasing something else as far as the masks, having that fear of, you know, if there's a deaf person who doesn't have a mask, that fear of, you know, what might happen, and people not engaging with us, and people trying to stay further away from us because we might not be wearing a mask, or that communication is just harder. I think it's important to, as a way of feeling included, for people to have that understanding of the situation that we have.
Thank you. And I certainly, when we were talking before, that was a bit of a kind of light bulb moment for me, something that, you know, I'd not considered, the impact of the kind of current health restrictions on the deaf community. So thank you for sharing that. So look,
Ben, can I just make one quick 30-second comment? I think one key thing for me is usually I get a phone call from social workers and other health professionals and saying we've got a refugee a community member or client that we're dealing with. How do we engage with? And it's okay to be culturally aware and sensitive, but sometimes that can embed or prevent us or become a barrier for us to actually provide a service. And usually what I would say is just engage with how you would engage with any other client. You will be asking exactly the same questions. It's good to have that background of the people's lived experiences, but sometimes we tend to use that to as a barrier to engaging and having frank and honest conversations. So sometimes it's actually good to say, look, I understand, but I will engage with you as a human being. And now I was looking at the comments and people talking about empathy and compassion and understanding, all of those. It's just the basic skills that we engage with every other client. And sometimes it's just the best thing to do is just engage with them as a client of yours, as you would engage with any other client.
Look, thanks, Abdi. And I really agree with you around treating people as people, but being very cognizant of some of the kind of accessibility barriers that they may be facing. And I think it kind of wraps up this section of the conversation really well, in that this sense of being authentic, not token, and treating people as equals will go a long way from an accessibility perspective. That doesn't then discount that for particular cohorts in particular times, there does need to be certain considerations made. Now, we are going to move to breakouts in a moment, and there's a little bit of kind of chaos in that for us in the new tech world. But Olivia, I've just got one quick question from you that I'm going to pick up from the chat. Do you have any examples of working with organisations that you feel have gotten it right when they're working with the deaf community? You mentioned your experience with YMCA previously, but is there anyone else in particular that you want to give a shout out to?
Unfortunately, there's not many that come to mind. There's always so much work involved to engage with other organisations. COVID specifically. We've had a lot of work with DHHS. A lot of discussions about how to make their content accessible for the deaf and hard of hearing community, their information. I was not involved at a high level. I wasn't involved with high level staff within DHHS, but the people that I was involved with was with the disability and COLD, the culturally and linguistically diverse group. And working with them was very different compared to just a random person within the department. They had a similar understanding or a similar background knowledge with deaf and COLD. We have some similar language experiences, I guess, and so we were able to alter the information to make sure that it was accessible and they had a greater understanding. So I think the person that you're referred to and the person that you engage with has a big impact on the process and the outcomes that can be achieved. Rather, having someone who has some of that background knowledge already is really helpful. In DHHS is obviously a very, very large organisation or department, and having, I don't have any influence within there, but the people that I work with may have some influence that can then flow on. So I think, if all you can do is give off your information to the right people, and then that can then spread out throughout that organisation that you're working with, and that can then flow on into the wider community as well. So finding and engaging with the right people with organisations is really important.
Thank you. So look, we're going to move into the breakout sessions, but I know, Abdi, that you need to head off. And I did mention this to the panel before. One of the downsides of an online conference, it's obviously very accessible, no one needs to leave their home, is that we don't get to give our panel a very, very warm round of applause. So I guess, on behalf of everyone that's tuned in today, I want to say a massive thank you both to Olivia and to Abdi in terms of your time, but also the work that you do and your quite obvious deep commitment to making engagement accessible. I think you are absolutely shining examples to all of us. So thank you so much for that. I'll leave some silence and we'll just imagine that there's a big round of applause.
Thank you very much, Pen, for organizing. It's a valuable session, and I'm glad to be part of that. I'm happy for you to share my contacts if people want to reach out and ask questions, or just learn from our co-design process. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. So look, we're going to move into some breakouts now. What you need to think about is that we are in real life and that we're in a large room, and there are various tables around the room, each of which has got a sign on that lists the title of the conversation that's going to take place there. Now, I did send out an email yesterday encouraging people to have the latest version of Zoom, which does allow you to choose your breakout room. So in a moment, Jacob, my colleague, will share the list of rooms and you'll be able to put yourself in rooms. If anyone's not able to do that, we will be able to help you. We can assign you to rooms. We'll jump in to make sure that you're in the right place as well. So there's a couple of kind of key instructions that will happen in that. I'll just share my screen. So apologies to Olivia because this will make the screen smaller for the interpreters. I will just point out that she is aware of what we're doing at the moment. Okay, so when you get into your breakout room, we want you to use the Jamboard link that Jacob has shared in the chat, and you will be able to click through a number of slides that we've got around the different themes of accessible engagement for young people. And so we've got the instructions on the side here. We want you to appoint a scribe. We want you to check in that everyone can access the Jamboard. If someone can't access the Jamboard, that's no problem. That's why you've got a scribe. And then for people that haven't used this feature before, you just come over to the side panel on the left. If you click on this sticky note and write your comment in here, so you can see there, and then click save. And so that puts up the sticky note onto each page. And the task, what we want, which is going to be based from your knowledge, based from the conversations that we've been exposed to today, is to have a think about what the golden rules of accessible engagement would be for that particular cohort. So work on that as a group. Like I've put in the notes there, make sure your discussions are inclusive. And what we're going to do is we will pull all of these comments together and we'll share those with all of the participants from the conference as well. So I certainly felt quite strongly that it can be an issue sometimes when we go to conferences that there's lots and lots of good discussion, but it doesn't lead us anywhere and there's no positive legacy. So we really want to, I guess, kind of co-create a resource here. And when we put the document together, there'll probably be some top tips from Kapia as well in terms of some of our suggestions around making engagement accessible for each of those groups. So I'll stop sharing my screen now. And what we'll do, Jacob, is if you can open up the breakout rooms. So you should be able to find on your screen, once they're open, in the bottom part of the screen, that you are able to go into a breakout room. If you've been assigned to a breakout room, you can jump in and join that one. You'll also be able to see the list of other breakout rooms there if you want to move on to another one. So like I said, this is a little bit of chaos. we are trying to recreate that notion of what it's like to be in a group and to be able to share some of our knowledge and experiences. So let's jump into the breakout rooms. Myself, some of the team from Kipia and Olivia will step into some of those rooms and see how those conversations are happening. And then we'll jump back out of the breakout rooms about 11:20, 11:25. So have great discussions and make sure that you record any of your comments or suggestions on the sticky notes. As someone said in the chat, there was a really amazing amount of ideas and rules that have been put up on the Jamboard. I'm just going to focus on one in particular, the accessible engagement for queer communities. So we did a piece of work for GoTAFE, which are a TAFE in Northern Victoria. It was really interesting working with the LGBTIQ plus community there in terms of developing a social justice charter. But some of the notes we've got here around asking around preferred pronouns, being genuine, not making assumptions about individuals, having inclusive signage at venues like gender neutral toilets. There's a whole bunch of really amazing things in there. As I said before, we will share these with all of the participants from the session. So this is not something that that will be kind of lost into the ether. We'll package it up and send it out to you. But before we finish, again, I really want to say thank you to you all for attending, for actively participating in the breakout room, but especially to our two speakers. Abdi has had to leave us, but Olivia, you know, it's been really amazing to hear your insights and to work with you. And I really thank you for your time. It's been fantastic.
No worries. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I'm happy to pass my contact information out to all of you, and you're welcome to contact me at any time if you have any questions or wanted to discuss anything.
Thank you. And to anybody that's left, this is only the second session for a 3-day conference. There's still lots of space because the spaces are unlimited for our other sessions. So if you've not booked into any other sessions, jump onto our website and you can click on anything that takes your fancy. Once again, thank you. And I'm sure we'll see you all soon in the future. Cheers.